e.g. calciferol. Okay, so calciferol is the technical term for vitamin D, and you could use either of those. So calciferol, you have taken it in through the digestive system, and it's then going to be diffusing through blood vessels. Eventually then, it's going to meet those cells. So it's going to be able to meet those cells. Now, because calciferol is hydrophobic, it's going to be able to diffuse straight through. So it's going to diffuse into the cell. And this is where we're thinking about the same kind of diagram that we looked at before, where it's going to diffuse through, and the vitamin D gets into the cell. And let's just label it like that. And it's going to bind to a receptor. Now, this receptor is actually, I'm just going to draw that, it's in the nucleus. So this is probably quite a high level difference, that the receptors inside, this receptor for calciferol, is in the nucleus. Once it binds, now we've got a receptor hormone complex. And that receptor hormone complex is then going to go and find the bit of DNA. It's going to find the correct gene. And the gene that it binds to is called cal-bindin. So the cal-bindin gene is in the DNA, in the nucleus. So the receptor hormone complex goes and it binds, well, it binds near to the cal-bindin gene. So if this was the DNA, the double-stranded DNA, there's going to be sections which are genes, and there are going to be sections which are not genes, because a gene is going to be able to create a protein. That's one definition of a gene, that it's got the information to make a protein. Whereas this bit here is not a gene, but we call it a regulatory sequence. So it's going to bind there. So these things, the receptor hormone complex, because it's going to bind, so it's going to bind up here. That's our receptor hormone complex with vitamin D. Because it's going to affect how the gene's used, it's called a transcription factor. And so it's a transcription factor because it's going to cause more transcription. So increased levels of transcription are going to happen. So what is transcription? Transcription is using DNA, and it is creating mRNA. And so we go from the double-stranded, and it's kind of a copy, and we make a single-strand mRNA copy. So in the case of vitamin D, it's causing more transcription, of increased transcription for the mRNA, and it is the mRNA which is going to lead to cal-bindin. And once that cal-bindin's been made, it's going to increase transcription of the protein, and this cal-bindin protein, it allows, so what it does is it enables calcium to get in. So, don't know whether you can see that up at the top. It allows, cal-bindin allows calcium absorption. So you might remember that we talked about before deficiencies. So if you have legs that become bowed, great diagram of legs here. If you have legs that become bowed out, this was called rickets. And rickets can be due either to not enough calcium, or it can be due to not enough vitamin D. Because if you don't have vitamin D, then you don't get cal binding, and then you can't take the calcium up into your cells. And if you can't absorb the calcium, then your bones become weak, and then they're going to be deformed. Okay, so that's a little run through of what that does. Okay, the other one to think about is what happens in the case of cortisol. So cortisol, let's just move that. Cortisol is known as one of the stress hormones. So stress causes an increased cortisol is a sign of stress, and it does the same thing. So it can, again, cortisol can, if we're thinking about it as a molecule, it can diffuse through. And this one, cortisol forms a receptor hormone complex, and this time it does it in the cytoplasm. So it's forming a receptor hormone complex in the cytoplasm, and then that complex will be moved into the nucleus. If it's not in the nucleus, it can't really affect what's happening with the genes. So again, it's going to find a DNA sequence, and in this case, it's going to increase the transcription of genes, and we don't really need to talk about specific ones, genes which are fight or flight. And these are genes which is associated with increasing blood glucose. So a lot of the proteins and the enzymes which are causing the breakdown of glycogen into glucose. So it means that stress, that cortisol, it can cause you to have a blood sugar spike. It can increase blood sugar. And that can be a bad thing when you're not actually, there's not actually a fight or flight situation. You might be stressed for other reasons, and then you don't actually use the glucose. So it's actually implicated in, can be implicated in diabetes as well. Okay, so that's cortisol. It goes through and it makes in the cytoplasm, that's where we get the receptor hormone complex being formed. Okay, right, that's the first two. So the other thing that it does is one of the things that would cause glycogen to be made would be insulin. So another high level bit is that insulin, because it's going to cause, insulin is the thing that's driving glucose being stored as glycogen. One of the things that cortisol will do is it will block, so it blocks insulin's effect. So it's going to, and it does that by decreasing the receptors for insulin. Okay, we've already had a look at epinephrine. So that was on our first diagram, so the idea of that. So we're going to have a look, the last bit that we're going to look at together is the pituitary hormones and the hypothalamus. So I'm going to get a new sheet. Okay, so up in the brain, we've got, it kind of looks like, and this isn't exactly what it's like, but this is good enough. We've got at the top, and this is all, so this is your head, and in the middle, you've got the hypothalamus. Well, it's towards the base. The hypothalamus is kind of a special region of the brain because it's made of neurons, so it's made of nerve cells, like most of the brain is. But these nerve cells are neurosecretory. So they're actually acting as an endocrine gland, although the gland function is really down here. So up in the hypothalamus, there's the start of nerve cells. And these nerve cells, they have dendrites which reach out. So I'm just drawing it as that. They've got a nucleus. And then it goes all the way down into the bottom region. And this region is the pituitary. So down to the bottom of the down at the bottom is the pituitary gland. And there are two sections to it. So in the first one, I've shown that there are these nerve cells, neurosecretory cells, which reach all the way down. So this is the cell body with the nucleus. But reaching all the way down are axons. And so that really is cell membrane all the way down and inside the cytoplasm. I'm just drawing it as one line. And at the end, there are axon terminals. So these are the end of the nerve cells. And so one part of the pituitary is getting its hormones from the hypothalamus. And the cells here don't actually do any production. So this bit, if we're thinking about someone's face, this is the posterior. So this is towards the rear. The posterior pituitary has these neurosecretory cells. And they create the hormones and then they release them into the blood here. So it's created here, it travels, all the hormones travel inside the cell all the way down, and then they get released into the blood down there. Okay, the other part is the front. So this would be towards your eyes. So the front of the body is called anterior. So this is where the person's eyes would be. Great drawing here. Okay, so their eyes would be pointing that way. So the anterior pituitary, this is not the same. So it is controlled. There are messages that travel down. There are messages called releasing factors. But actually, the cells here, they will produce and release. So there's a bit of a difference in terms of whether they're actually created, produced in the pituitary or not. So for the anterior pituitary, we need releasing factors, and then the cells here will release the hormones into the blood. So in both ways, it's acting as an endocrine gland, because it's releasing hormones into the blood, which then will travel around the body. Okay, so let's think about a way, I think we did mention it last time, but I'm going to go over it again. So a way of remembering these hormones, the anterior, so ants for anterior, love fish. Ants love fish means that the anterior releases LH and FSH. Now, LH is and FSH, they are both menstrual cycle hormones. So they're involved in regulating the menstrual cycle. LH is called luteinizing hormone, but we don't really need to write luteinizing hormone. We can always write LH. And it has a role, and we'll come back to this, but this is what causes ovulation. Okay, so we've got ovulation for LH, and FSH. FSH is involved, it's follicle stimulating hormone. And what it does, a follicle contains an egg cell. And so what it does is every month it's released and it causes one of those egg cells to develop and to grow. So follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, so anterior, it's the two reproductive hormones. Ants love fish. Now down to the posterior, and the posterior we can remember pardon. I actually had grade 12s writing it down, so for some of them it did work. I don't know, I mean, some of you might have different ways of trying to remember it. So we've got, for this, this is to try and remember that the posterior is neurosecretory, that the neurons that start up in the hypothalamus are the things releasing. So P for posterior, pardon, like a French person saying sorry. So pardon. ADH, well, is ADH. It's you can see that antidiuretic hormone. So antidiuretic hormone. It's basically anti-P hormone. It's going to stop you from urinating as much. So it's a water conservation hormone. Okay, so we get ADH, and then the other one is oxytocin. And this is going to be involved in milk secretion. So for women who have just given birth and who are starting to create milk, they need oxytocin, which they get when you cuddle the baby or you look at the baby, or if the baby starts to feed, then oxytocin's released. And then the final N is to try and remember that these are neurosecretory cells, that it doesn't actually, the posterior does not produce its own hormones. Whereas the anterior, these cells do produce and release LH and FSH. For the posterior, it doesn't produce and release, it's neurosecretory. So the axons release the hormone into the blood and then it will travel around and start to have its effect. So what's going to stimulate the release over here is electrical impulses. So nerve impulses from the brain will travel down and then that will stimulate the release at the right time. Over here it was releasing factors which are going to cause these cells to release the hormone. And a lot of the time we've got negative feedback, so there'll be detection in the hypothalamus. It contains lots of receptors. And so when it releases a hormone and it has its effect, there'll then be negative feedback to switch it off. Okay, we're going to just have a look now at ADH secretion. So there will be a video of this. I'll make the video available if you want to go back if it was a bit too quick. So we're going to have a think about what does ADH do. Okay, so if this is the blood that's flowing in, inside the blood we've got water and we also have solutes, e.g. salt and glucose. And these are going to flow through and they're going to get to the hypothalamus in the brain. And what it's going to do is it's going to have receptors. So this is my receptor here. It's going to have receptors for glucose and for solute. And through detecting that, it can work out solute concentration. Because if we were to get far too much, if we had a lot of glucose in the blood, then that wouldn't be good, because it would be too concentrated, and then we get water moving in, and we would get high blood pressure. The blood would get too thick and sticky, so we'd get lack of blood flow, so all the things associated with diabetes. So the hypothalamus needs to detect this, so it detects and monitors the blood solute or blood solute concentration, and then it's going to help to control it. So the thing that's going to be involved in this is, well, we talked about just then the anti-ATP is ADH, and this was from the posterior pituitary. Okay, so what's going to happen? Up here we've got, in the hypothalamus, we're going to have these receptors. They're going to detect, and if they see that there is too little water, the water has gone down, and therefore, or the solutes have gone up, and you have too little water, then we need a signal coming down to the end, and we need to release ADH. So ADH is going to get released into the blood, and it's going to travel through the blood, because now what it needs to do is make sure that there is more water in the blood. We need to conserve water. So it's going to travel all the way to this is a drawing of a kidney. It's going to travel all the way to the kidney, and it's going to affect what the kidney does. So one of the functions, and we'll get onto it next in the next unit, the next part of the unit, is the kidney is going to regulate water content. Okay, so the kidney regulates water content, and it also removes waste material. Okay, so blood's flowing in, and what the kidney can do is the kidney can either, let's just move that down, the kidney can take the water out, and it will pool it. So if there's too much water, it's going to take the water out of the blood, and it's going to pool it, and it's going to go towards, you've got two kidneys, it's going to go towards the bladder. So its job there is to regulate water content by allowing some of it to go down the ureter, pool down the ureter, and then go to the bladder, and then you would urinate it out. Okay, so if you've got a lot of solutes and you don't have enough water, then you're going to release ADH. ADH is going to travel down to the kidney, and what it's going to do is it's going to try and make sure that you don't lose any water. So it's going to stop the water going down into the bladder. So how does it do this? And we'll go into more detail next. Well, in the kidney, there are tubes down which the water and the other waste products are flowing. And down these tubes, there can be, so I'll draw it as a double membrane, there can be pores. And these pores, these are water pores. They are called aquaporins. So the aquaporins are facilitated diffusion. They're facilitated diffusion channels. And this bit here, this is called the collecting duct. Okay, so at the moment I've shown that there are quite a few pores, and in that case water would be absorbed through. So we'd get water leaving the collecting duct and going back into the blood. If there are lots of pores there, then that's a good thing. We're absorbing, in terms of retaining water, we're going to absorb lots of water back into the blood. Now, if we absorb a lot of water out of here, then the urine that comes down, the urine that's coming out, if we absorb the water out, we're going to make concentrated urine. This is when your urine turns a dark colour. It's become concentrated because you've absorbed a lot of water. So what has ADH done? ADH goes to the collecting duct and it causes an increase in aquaporins. More aquaporins, these channels, join the membrane. And if we get more aquaporins joining the membrane, we have more facilitated diffusion. The water now can move out and be absorbed. And that leads to concentrated urine. We get less volume of urine. So you go to the toilet and it will be darker in colour and you will have less urine. So that's if you're dehydrated. Okay, so what happens if you're hydrated? Well, if you're hydrated, we don't get, so hydrated equals no ADH release. And if we don't get ADH, then we don't get these, and so that's basically going to block. There's not going to be channels, and so the water's going to go all the way through. This is where you go to the toilet and you have a large volume, no ADH, you're going to make a large volume of dilute urine. Whereas when we've got ADH, if you're dehydrated, you're going to have ADH and you're going to have a small volume of, sorry, I can't quite fit that there, concentrated urine. Okay, so that's what ADH does. It comes from the, it's created in the hypothalamus, travels down the axons of the neurosecretory cells, and then because of electrical impulses due to receptors, which were monitoring our blood concentration, our water concentration or solute concentration overall, it gets released, it travels down, it creates more aquaporin channels so that water can be absorbed back into the blood. So we get small volume of concentrated urine. If you're well hydrated and you need to get rid of water, then no ADH and you make a large volume of dilute urine because you're not going to have these aquaporin channels down there. Okay, we're going to do the final bit before we get you into groups, which is the regulation of milk secretion. Okay, so in the breasts we have, they are actually a exocrine gland for female breasts, and in the breast there are cells which are going to, again, they've got that kind of the duct shape, so they're going to secrete into a duct. The idea of those cells being around ducts, we did that diagram before, these cells which are going to create and secrete, in this case, milk, so human breast milk. And so this doesn't happen all the time. We want it to be regulated, and it's going to be regulated again by the brain. And so from the brain we have two hormones, and actually we didn't mention this one, so ants love fish. We might need to make it ants love fish pie, because the final one is prolactin from the anterior. So ants love fish pie, and now we're bringing in prolactin, which is from the anterior. Okay, so the brain's involved in this, and so normally the brain and the hypothalamus and the pituitary will not be signalling the breasts to create milk. So that's only going to happen towards the end of pregnancy. So prolactin is the first one, which is going to come down. So prolactin is going to be released into the blood by the anterior pituitary. And what it does is prolactin, the way I try and remember it is prolactin is about kind of production. Prolactin is for production, and to help produce, it's going to increase the size of breasts. So any pregnant woman will know this, that during pregnancy, towards the end, your breasts increase in size, and that means, you know, that they can become uncomfortable, they can become kind of swollen as the cells are dividing, and there's an increase in the number of these glands and the number of cells. So prolactin increases the size of breasts, and that we normally wouldn't have that happening because there's an inhibition. So when we draw this line like that, it means an inhibition. Normally estrogen, which would be being released, inhibits prolactin. So in a non-pregnant female, estrogen would be inhibiting. But when we are approaching the time of birth, we get a reduction in estrogen. And so if we reduce estrogen, it's no longer going to inhibit prolactin. And so when estrogen falls, we get more prolactin. Increased prolactin would lead to increased growth of the breast and increased size of the exocrine glands. And so we can have more production. But before you give birth, you don't actually release the milk. So we only get the release of milk after birth, and usually with the stimulation of a baby trying to feed. So the sucking stimulation of the breast is going to lead to the release. So the one that causes that is oxytocin. Oxytocin it allows the ejection or the release of milk. So looking at a baby, having the baby in physical contact will cause a release of oxytocin, and an increase of oxytocin then allows these cells to release the milk, and then the milk will begin to flow down the ducts and out of the breast. Okay, so I think that's all I wanted to go through on this, so we're going to stop that there.